The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. A young girl, no older than 12, sat quietly beside her lawyer. She hadn't spoken a word since the case began. In fact, she hadn't spoken a word in years. Nobody knew why. Some believed it was trauma. Others thought it was a medical condition. But whatever the reason, her silence had become her shield. Her only companion was a golden retriever named Max, a service dog trained to assist her. Max never left her side, his large, intelligent eyes watching everything around them. The judge, an older man with a stern face softened only by the wisdom of years, had been intrigued by the girl's presence. The case was serious, involving allegations that could change lives forever. And the girl, she was the key witness. The defense attorney, a man known for his ruthless cross-examinations, smirked as he stood up. "Your Honor, how can we take testimony from someone who refuses to speak?" he scoffed. "This is highly irregular." The prosecutor, a woman with sharp eyes and a firm stance, didn't waver. "She has a right to communicate in her own way," she replied, "and we intend to prove it." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. "Proceed," he allowed. The room fell silent as the girl reached down and gently placed her hand on Max's head. The golden retriever perked up immediately, ears twitching. Then, in the subtlest of movements, her fingers curled in a series of light taps against his fur. The dog responded instantly. Max stood up, walked to the center of the courtroom, and sat down, his tail resting still on the floor. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he lifted his right paw and placed it firmly on the ground twice. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. "What is this?" the defense lawyer asked, feigning amusement but clearly unnerved. The prosecutor stepped forward, her voice clear and commanding. "Max has been trained to interpret her signals. The taps she just gave, that was her telling him to identify the guilty party." The judge's brow furrowed. "And how do we know this is legitimate?" "We anticipated the skepticism, Your Honor," the prosecutor said, stepping aside. "So we arranged a test." A bailiff walked forward, holding a stack of identical-looking photos, each showing different individuals. The girl tapped Max's head once, and the bailiff placed the photos in front of him. The dog sniffed, hesitated, then nudged one particular image with his nose. Gasps filled the courtroom. It was a defendant's picture. The defense attorney shot up from his seat. "This is a trick," he barked. "That dog—" The judge silenced him with a raised hand. His expression had shifted from skepticism to something closer to awe. He turned his gaze toward the girl, who sat motionless, her hands resting in her lap. For the first time in the entire trial, she looked directly at the judge. And then, something unexpected happened. A single tear slipped down her cheek. The weight of the moment settled over the room, like a dense fog. It wasn't just about the dog. It wasn't just about the signals. It was about a child who had been silenced for too long, finding a way to make her truth heard. The judge exhaled slowly, his decision already forming. He looked at the prosecutor. This case just took a very different turn. And with that, the course of justice was forever changed. The room remained eerily silent as the realization sank in. The golden retriever, Max, sat calmly by the photograph, his tail still, his body unwavering. It was as if he knew the weight of his actions. The defendant, a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but the man's face had lost its earlier confidence. The judge leaned forward, studying the girl. Does she have more to say? His voice was softer now, less authoritative, almost as if he were afraid of shattering the fragile moment. The prosecutor turned toward the girl. "Would you like to continue?" she asked gently. The girl blinked once and nodded. Her small hands moved with precision, pressing against Max's fur in another series of taps. This time, Max walked back to her side and sat. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the girl raised her hands and began signing. A court-appointed interpreter, who had been waiting quietly, immediately stepped forward. She says, "He did this to me. He thought I would never be able to tell anyone." A stunned silence fell over the room. The judge's eyes darkened, his fingers interlacing as he sat back in his chair. The prosecutor turned sharply toward the defendant. Do you still want to claim this is a trick? She asked, her voice unwavering. The defense lawyer stood up, his face a mask of controlled panic. Your Honor, this is highly unorthodox. We cannot. Sit down, the judge commanded. His tone left no room for argument. The girl's breathing was steady now, but her fingers moved faster, her hands flying as she signed her story. The interpreter kept up, her voice breaking slightly as she translated. He hurt me. He told me not to speak. He said no one would believe me. He said if I ever told anyone, I would regret it. The defendant's face drained of color. He started shaking his head, muttering something under his breath. His lawyer grabbed his arm, but he yanked it away. The girl wasn't done. Her hands continued moving. But Max knew, the interpreter said, her voice catching. Max saw what happened. He was there when I cried. He was there when I wanted to run. He was there when I needed to tell someone. And now I have... The judge exhaled, the weight of the testimony settling into his very bones. The bailiff exchanged a glance with him, awaiting his orders. The courtroom felt frozen in time. Then the prosecutor's voice cut through the silence. Your Honor, given this testimony, I move to have a defendant taken into immediate custody. The judge didn't hesitate. Granted. The moment the words left his lips, the bailiff stepped forward. The defendant stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. This is absurd, he shouted. She's lying. But he didn't get to finish. Max, the ever-loyal golden retriever, suddenly stood between him and the girl, a deep, warning growl rising from his throat. The courtroom collectively held its breath. The defendant froze. His chest rose and fell rapidly as if he'd finally realized he had lost. 2 officers moved in, gripping his arms and restraining him. The sound of handcuffs clicking into place was the only thing that broke the silence. The defendant struggled briefly, his face twisting in fury, but his protests were drowned out by the undeniable truth that had just unfolded. The girl remained still, her hands slowly lowering into her lap. For the first time, she looked free, as if a weight had finally lifted. The judge cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. You're very brave, he told her. Thank you for speaking today. She didn't respond with words, but Max did. He walked over to her, pressing his warm head into her lap. The girl smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. As the courtroom emptied, the prosecutor approached her. You did it, she said softly. The girl looked at her, then at Max, and signed 2 simple words. He knew. The prosecutor swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, he did. And with that, the case that almost went unheard made history, proving that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. The aftermath of the trial sent shockwaves through the entire state. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately, headlines flashing across screens and newspapers. Brave silent girl uses dog to expose abuser in court. Golden retriever helps deliver justice in landmark trial. A child's silence broken through the loyalty of a dog. The girl's name remained protected, but the world knew her story. Advocates for abuse victims praised her courage, and legal experts debated whether this trial would change the way testimony was handled for nonverbal witnesses. Despite the overwhelming media attention, the girl and Max retreated into privacy. The case was over, but her journey wasn't. There was healing to do, nightmares to face, and a life to rebuild. She was placed in a safe home with a foster family trained to support children with trauma. It was strange at first, new people, new surroundings, but Max was with her every step of the way, every night. When the darkness crept in and the ghosts of her past threatened to take hold, Max would press against her, his warmth anchoring her to the present. Slowly, she started to come out of her shell. She spent more time in the backyard, feeling the grass under her feet, the sun on her face. She still didn't speak, but that didn't mean she wasn't communicating. With Max, she didn't need words. One day, her foster mother, a kind woman named Linda, found her sitting on the porch with Max, her fingers tapping lightly on his fur. Do you want to go somewhere? Linda asked gently. The girl hesitated, then nodded. Linda smiled. Anywhere in particular? The girl thought for a long moment before signing a word Linda hadn't seen her use before. The foster mother turned to Max, as if he would know the answer. The dog wagged his tail. "Let's go," Linda said. The return. An hour later, they pulled up in front of the courthouse. It was eerily quiet now, so different from the day of the trial. The girl stepped out of the car, hesitating only slightly before walking toward the entrance. Linda followed at a respectful distance as the girl led Max to the same doors she had walked through weeks ago. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to. Instead, she stood on the steps, staring up at the building. This was the place where she had broken her silence. This was the place where justice had finally been served. Max sat beside her, leaning against her leg. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then, for the first time in years, she opened her mouth and whispered a single word. "Max." It was barely audible, but it was real. Max's ears perked up. He turned his head toward her, tail wagging, sensing the significance of the moment. Linda's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes shining with tears. The girl smiled, small but sure. She had found her voice again. And Max, her ever-loyal companion, had never once stopped listening. The beginning of a new chapter. From that moment on, things began to change. Her therapy sessions became easier. She still relied on sign language most of the time, but now, little by little, she was willing to try speaking again. At first, it was only with Max, then with Linda, eventually with her therapist. She even started school again, an alternative program that specialized in children who had experienced trauma. It wasn't easy, but she wasn't alone. One afternoon, during a classroom activity, the teacher asked everyone to write down their greatest hero. The girl didn't hesitate. She wrote 4 letters. And my ex. Her classmates were curious, and for the first time, she didn't mind their questions. She smiled and signed, "He saved me." And for the first time, she didn't just feel like a survivor. She felt like someone with a future. As the seasons changed, so did the girl's world. Life was no longer defined by fear, by silence, by the weight of unspoken memories. It was filled with small but powerful victories. Whispering Max's name, laughing soundlessly when he did something silly, making eye contact with people she once feared to face. Max was with her through it all. One autumn afternoon, as the golden leaves crunched beneath her boots, Linda knelt beside her on the porch. "There's something I want to talk to you about," she said gently. The girl tilted her head, waiting. Linda took a deep breath. "I would like to adopt you, if that's something you want." The girl froze. The world around her seemed to pause, as if waiting for her reaction. She had spent so long being lost, being someone no one wanted to listen to, someone people overlooked. And now, here was Linda, offering her a home, a future. Tears welled in her eyes. She looked down at Max, who simply wagged his tail, as if he already knew her answer. She didn't sign. She didn't whisper. She nodded. Linda's face broke into a smile, and she pulled the girl into a hug. For the first time in years, the girl felt what it was like to be held without fear, without tension. She was home, a calling discovered. As time passed, she continued her therapy and schooling, learning how to navigate a world that had once seemed impossible to face. Her voice grew stronger, still soft, still rare, but no longer absent. She used her word when she wanted, her hands when she needed, and Max understood both. One day, while volunteering at an animal shelter with Linda, she noticed a small boy sitting alone, staring at the floor. "He's like me," she signed to Linda. Linda glanced at the boy's file. "He's been through a lot. He doesn't talk either." The girl thought for a moment before kneeling beside him. She placed her hand on the floor between them, giving him space, letting him decide. Then she tapped lightly against her palm, the same way she had once signaled Max. The boy hesitated, then mirrored the movement. A spark ignited inside her. Later that night, she signed to Linda, "I want to help kids like me." And from that moment, a new dream was born, a voice that would change the world. Years passed. She grew, she learned, she thrived. She became an advocate, speaking at events, raising awareness for children who have been silenced by fear, by trauma, by a world that didn't always know how to listen. She studied animal-assisted therapy, determined to help others the way Max had helped her. She worked with therapy dogs, training them to support children who struggled to communicate, just as she once had. And one day, at a conference filled with hundreds of people, she stood on a stage, Max at her side. The microphone loomed before her, the crowd waiting. She took a deep breath, placed a hand on Max's head for comfort, and stepped forward. Then, in a clear, steady voice, she began to speak. Once, I thought my silence was my prison, but now I know it was my strength, because sometimes the ones who don't speak have the most powerful voices of all. The room erupted into applause. Max wagged his tail, and for the first time in her life, she knew without a shadow of a doubt that she had finally been heard. The standing ovation washed over her like a wave, loud yet comforting. She felt no fear, no hesitation, just the warmth of knowing that her story, once trapped inside her, had finally been set free. As she stepped off the stage, people approached her, some in tears, some simply wanted to shake her hand. But the most important presence was right beside her. Max, his golden fur shimmered under the stage lights as he pressed his nose against a palm. He had been there through everything, and even now, as she stepped into this new chapter of her life, he remained her anchor. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, she looked at the framed photo on her desk, her younger self sitting on the courthouse steps, Max by her side. She traced the edge of the frame with her fingers, remembering that day, remembering how the world had seemed so large, so terrifying. And now, here she was, no longer that silent girl in the courtroom, but a woman who had turned her pain into purpose. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Linda stood there, her eyes filled with pride. They had remained close over the years, their bond unbreakable. Linda stepped inside, holding a small envelope. "This came for you today," she said, handing it over. She took it hesitantly, recognizing the official seal stamped in the corner. Slowly, she slid her finger under the flap and pulled out the letter inside. As her eyes scanned the words, she felt her breath hitch. It was from the state's legal department. They wanted her to be part of a new program, one that would train therapy dogs specifically to assist children in courtrooms. They had heard her story. They had seen what Max had done. And now, they wanted her to help shape the future for others like her. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the letter. Max let out a soft huff, as if he understood. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead against his. "We did it," she whispered. The following months passed in a blur of training sessions, meetings, and courtroom visits. Every time she walked into a courthouse, she felt a pang of memory, of fear of the past. But then she would see a child sitting in a chair, eyes wide with uncertainty, and she knew exactly why she was there. She knelt beside them, introduced them to a gentle therapy dog, and signed the words she had once wished someone had told her. "You are not alone." One afternoon, a case caught her attention. A young boy, barely 8 years old, was scheduled to testify against a man who had hurt him. The attorneys worried he wouldn't be able to speak. He hadn't said a word since the incident. She knew that feeling all too well. She asked to meet him before the hearing. When she entered the waiting room, he sat in a corner, his arms wrapped tightly around himself. A black Labrador sat beside him, trained just like Max. She took a deep breath and approached slowly, dropping to his level. She didn't push, didn't force him to look at her. Instead, she placed her hand flat on the floor between them and tapped lightly, just as she had done with Max all those years ago. The boy's eyes flickered toward her, curious but cautious. He didn't move at first, but then, slowly, his small hand lifted, and he tapped the floor in response. She smiled. He wasn't ready to speak, and that was okay. When he walked into the courtroom that day, the Labrador was by his side, and so was she. He didn't say a word, but when the prosecutor asked him a question, he placed his hand on the dog's back and gave a tiny signal. The dog responded just as Max once had, and that was enough. The judge understood. The jury understood. And most importantly, the boy understood that his silence didn't make him powerless. After the trial, as the courtroom emptied, he tugged on her sleeve. She turned to him, waiting, his lips parted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Her heart swelled. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and nodded. That evening, as she sat outside with Max, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized something. For years, she had thought her story ended in that courtroom, the day justice had been served. But she had been wrong. The night air was crisp, the sky a canvas of deep indigo speckled with stars. She leaned back against the wooden steps of her porch. Max curled up beside her, his rhythmic breathing a comforting presence. The day's events still lingered in her mind. The boy, his whisper of gratitude, the way his fingers had trembled before making that small but powerful signal. She had seen herself in him. There had been a time when she thought silence was a cage, a prison she would never escape. But tonight, she realized something else. Silence could also be a language of strength, a voice of its own. Max stirred, lifting his head to nuzzle her hand. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of his loyalty, his unwavering presence. She had been given a second chance at life, and she had vowed to make it count. A few days later, she received another letter, this time from a university. They had read about her work and were offering her a full scholarship to study psychology and animal-assisted therapy. It felt surreal, almost too good to be true. But when she looked at Max, she knew this was exactly where she was meant to be. The transition to student life was strange at first. The lectures were long, the reading assignments dense. She still preferred to communicate through sign language most of the time, but slowly, her voice grew stronger. She found her rhythm, just like she always had, with patience, with persistence. One afternoon, as she sat outside on campus, flipping through her textbook, she noticed a girl sitting alone on a bench, head bowed, shoulders curled inward. She recognized that posture, the weight of an untold story. Max seemed to sense it too. He walked toward the girl, tail wagging gently but not intrusively. The girl looked up, startled. "His name is Max," she said softly, her own voice still a marvel to her sometimes. The girl hesitated before reaching out, fingers brushing through Max's fur. "He's beautiful," the girl murmured. She nodded, watching as Max worked his quiet magic. After a long silence, the girl whispered, "I had a dog once. Before everything changed." She didn't push, didn't ask for details. She simply sat beside her, letting the moment unfold. Max laid down between them, a bridge between two souls who understood what it meant to carry pain. For a long time they sat in silence, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a promise. By the time the sun began to set, the girl looked at her and asked, "Do you think I could meet more dogs like Max?" She smiled, her answer clear. "Yes, I think that would be good." And just like that, another journey began. Years later, she would stand in a courtroom again, not as a victim, but as an advocate, not as someone testifying, but as someone ensuring that no child would ever feel unheard again. Max, older now but still just as loyal, would sit by her side, his presence as steady as ever. And as she looked across the room at another young boy, another frightened child with a story to tell, she would kneel, place her palm on the floor, and tap, just as she had done years ago. A small hand would lift, tap, and the cycle of healing would begin again. You said, the years moved forward like pages turning in a book, each chapter bringing new stories, new lives touched, and new battles fought. She devoted herself entirely to her studies, blending psychology with her deep understanding of animal-assisted therapy. Every class, every paper, every case study was more than just an assignment. It was another step toward ensuring that no child would ever stand alone in a courtroom again. Max remained by her side through it all. His fur had turned a little grayer around the muzzle, his movements slower, but his spirit remained unchanged. He still sensed when she needed him, still pressed close when old nightmares tried to creep in. And he still had his way of working magic with others, children, survivors, even hardened attorneys who would pause just to scratch behind his ears, unwittingly allowing their own burdens to momentarily lighten. Her advocacy work grew. She partnered with legal teams, trained therapy dogs, and even consulted on cases where nonverbal children needed alternative ways to communicate. Word of her work spread beyond the state, reaching organizations that wanted to implement similar programs. She traveled, spoke at conferences, and shared her story, not because she wanted recognition, but because she wanted others to see what was possible. One day, she received a call from an attorney who had worked on her case all those years ago. He was older now, but his voice carried the same steady confidence. "There's something you should know," he said. A new law had been passed, one inspired in part by her case. Courts across the country were now required to allow trained therapy animals in cases involving minors or trauma survivors. No longer would a child be forced to face their fears alone. The silent signals, the gentle presence of a dog, the small moment of comfort that had once helped her, it would now help countless others. She hung up the phone and turned to Max, who lay curled up on his favorite rug. She sank down beside him, pressing her forehead gently against his. "We did it," she whispered. He let out a soft sigh, as if he understood. Time, however, remained relentless. Not long after, Max's body began to slow beyond what even love and devotion could sustain. The vet confirmed what she already knew in her heart. Max was tired. He had spent his life carrying others, absorbing their pain, giving them strength. And now, it was time for him to rest. The last night they spent together, she lay beside him, whispering stories into the darkness, of the courtroom, of the boy who had whispered his thanks, of the girl on the bench who had asked about more dogs like him. She told him about the law, about the children he had helped without ever knowing their names. And as the sun rose, Max took one final, shuddering breath and was gone. The loss was unbearable, but she carried it like she had carried everything else, with quiet resilience. She allowed herself to grieve, but she did not stop, because Max had left her a mission and she would see it through. Years passed. She continued her work, but now a new golden retriever walked beside her, a young dog, trained in the very methods Max had helped inspire. One day, she found herself back at the courthouse where her journey had begun. A new case, a new child in need of a voice. She knelt beside them, placed her palm on the floor, and tapped. A hesitant hand lifted, a tap in return. And in that moment, she knew Max was still with her, not in body, but in every child who found the courage to speak. In every courtroom where a therapy dog sat beside someone in need. In every silent voice that finally was heard. The courthouse was no longer a place of fear for her. It was a battlefield she had learned to navigate, a place where stories were rewritten, where justice found its voice through those who had once been silent. As she walked through the halls, the golden retriever beside her matched her pace, sensing the gravity of where they were. Though he was not Max, he carried the same spirit, the same quiet understanding. Today's case was one she had prepared for carefully. A young girl, barely 6, called to testify against someone who had stolen her innocence. The prosecutors feared she wouldn't speak. They had seen it before, the way trauma silenced children in the most crucial moments. But she had seen something else. She had seen how silence could speak in its own way. When she entered the waiting room, the girl sat in a chair too big for her, legs swinging nervously. Her hands were clenched into small fists in her lap. The child didn't lift her head as she approached, but the golden retriever walked forward first, sniffing gently before sitting down at her feet. The girl's fingers twitched. She knelt beside them, pressing her palm to the floor. A soft tap. A moment passed, stretching long and uncertain. Then, hesitantly, the girl lifted her hand and tapped back. Relief flooded through her. It was a start. She didn't ask the child to speak. She simply sat beside her, waiting, letting the presence of the dog work its quiet magic. Slowly, those small fingers uncurled, reaching forward to stroke the golden fur. The dog licked her hand, gentle and reassuring. And then, for the first time since the trial began, the girl whispered, "Dog." It wasn't a testimony. It wasn't a full sentence. But it was enough. By the time she walked into the courtroom, she had found her strength. She sat in the witness stand, the dog at her feet, and when the questions came, her voice, soft, shaking but real, answered them. The judge, the attorneys, the jury, Everyone in that room saw it happen. They saw the way courage could be borrowed from a small, warm presence. They saw how something as simple as a heartbeat, beside, you could change the course of justice. When the verdict was read days later, she stood beside the child's mother, holding her hand as relief broke through the tension in the air. Another battle won. Another child heard. As she stepped outside, she let the sunlight wash over her, breathing in the crisp air. The golden retriever wagged his tail beside her, waiting for the next step. She smiled, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "Come on," she murmured. "We've got more work to do." Because she knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be another child, another case, another courtroom waiting for someone to stand beside them. And she would be there. Always.